The town of Plymouth is known for its cultural significance in American history. Field trips to Plymouth Rock are almost as old as the rock itself. But in Plymouth, there is interesting history on every street. We took a walk on North Street with Executive Director Ann Mason of the Plymouth Antiquarian Society to learn about how this street has made history.
Today we're going to walk down one of Plymouth's most historic and beautiful streets in the downtown, North Street. This street has surviving houses from the 18th and 19th century and is largely intact from those periods. The street was laid out in 1633 and at that time was simply known as New Street to distinguish it from First Street, what today we call Leyden Street to the south. In 1633, this was pretty much the northern end of Plymouth's downtown. As the town grew, more streets were laid out, more houses were built, more businesses were established, and North Street began to look a little bit differently. Its name changed as well. It became known as Queen Street. And if you didn't know, the street just to the south paralleling North Street is called today Middle Street, but then in the 18th century was known as King Street. These names remind us that for over 150 years, Plymouth was a small town, part of a much larger British Empire, and Plymouthians were supposed to be loyal subjects to the British king. Some of those Plymouthians started to have different ideas about what it meant to be a British subject, and we'll hear those stories as we walk down North Street. The house behind me was built by General John Winslow in 1726. It later became the home of the Warren family, and General James Warren and his wife Mercy Otis Warren were some of the leading Plymouthians who supported the cause of the American Revolution and wanted the colonies to declare independence from the British monarchy. General James Warren was a descendant of Richard Warren, the Pilgrim. He was very prominent here in Plymouth, and during the Revolution he served as Paymaster General of the Continental Army. He was also Speaker of the House of Representatives in Massachusetts and in the Provisional Congress here as well. His wife surpassed him in many ways in terms of fame and prominence in the Revolutionary period. Mercy Otis Warren was born and grew up in Barnstable. She lived here in Plymouth after her marriage to James Warren. She was a prolific writer. She wrote plays and satires. And after the Revolution in 1805, she published the first history of the American Revolution. She's someone that's often forgotten today, but she really was an incredibly important member of that first generation of American leaders and thinkers. And she corresponded with George Washington, with John and Abigail Adams. And I think Plymouth really should claim her again as one of the most important first ladies, so to speak, of the American Revolution. Here we are in front of the Plymouth Center for the Arts complex on North Street. Now this lot of land was once owned by Colonel George Watson, who was one of Plymouth's leading citizens in the 18th century. He was also probably the most prosperous citizen of Plymouth in his lifetime. During the American Revolution, unlike the Warrens at the top of the street, George Watson actually was sympathetic to the cause of the British Crown, and a lot of cases he was suspected of being a loyalist. However, fortunately for him, he was so well respected in town that he managed to keep a very low profile during the war years. And he was not driven out and had to seek refuge in England across the ocean or up in the Canadian colonies. Instead, he stayed right here, lived a long life, and at the time of his death in 1800, he was honored with many different signs of local mourning for his life and recognition of his role as a prominent citizen. Now his estate, which he had built in the mid-18th century, actually burned down. The family who owned the estate after him, the Jacksons, ended up building their own house in the 1830s, which we can see right here to my left. Now that house eventually became owned by the Hathaway family. It was a private residence, and then at different points it was actually operated as a boarding house or a hotel. And it was known at that time as the Lindens in recognition of the line of linden trees that used to grow right here on North Street. It was said that Colonel George Watson had planted those linden trees and they lived really into the 1960s. But the Lindens house here in the 1830s became connected later in its history to a very new building to my right, the Russell Library. And we can walk over to the Russell Library and learn more about it. What's now one of the galleries in the Plymouth Center for the Arts was originally built as the Russell Library. Funds to build this library were given by the children of William and Mary Ellen Russell in 1901. They wanted a way to remember their parents, and so they approached the Plymouth Library Corporation and said, "We'd like to allow you to build a permanent library building for the town of Plymouth." Now, the Plymouth Public Library had been founded in the mid-19th century, but it didn't actually have its own location. And so, using the Russell family money, the library was able to build the building behind me. The building was designed by the Boston architectural firm of Mead and Everett, and it's built in the colonial revival style of architecture. This building remained the library's home base until the early 1990s when the Plymouth Public Library moved to South Street into a large and new building. So this building eventually became the Plymouth Center for the Arts thanks to funding from the Community Preservation Act. And most recently, it has been connected. There's a new main entrance that was added to connect and complete the transitional space between the Lindens and the Russell Library. And today, Plymouth has this wonderful Center for the Arts, which is used for many different community events and art displays and activities, exhibits, all sorts of things. The Spooner House Museum is one of the historic houses owned by the Plymouth Antiquarian Society, which is open to the public for guided tours. The house was originally built in the 1740s by Josiah Ryder, and its first occupant was his sister, Hannah Ryder Jackson. Hannah Jackson lived in the house after she was widowed, and she sold chocolate to support herself. Chocolate at that time in the 18th century was a very fashionable beverage. After Hannah's death, the house passed to her granddaughter, Elizabeth Shurtleff. And in 1764, Elizabeth married Ephraim Spooner, who was a leading merchant in the town of Plymouth. Ever since 1764, the property has been lived in by the Spooner family, by Ephraim and Elizabeth's descendants, all the way until 1954, when the last resident, James Spooner, passed away. James wanted to leave the house as a museum so that everyone who came to Plymouth could see it and could learn about the town's history as well as his family's history. One of the special things about the Spooner House is that it includes all of the original furnishings. So everything that James Spooner had, he left in the house to be part of the museum. So when you come to the Spooner House, you're seeing 200 years of family possessions from different periods, all of which are, for the most part, in the locations that James left them. We've crossed the street and are technically now on Winslow Street, but we can't talk about North Street and not talk about this house, which is part of this very historic neighborhood. It is today known as the Mayflower Society House and has been the headquarters of the General Society of Mayflower Descendants since 1941. But it was actually built in 1754 by Edward Winslow. Now, he was a loyalist, and unlike Colonel George Watson, Winslow actually did leave Plymouth in 1781. He fled to Canada because of his loyalist sympathies. In 1898, Charles Willoughby, all the way from Chicago, purchased this house, and he wanted it to be a grand summer home. So he hired architect Joseph Everett Chandler to come and remodel it for him. So what you see today is really Chandler's vision of the colonial revival style of architecture. Chandler added the cupola, the veranda, he added wings on the side of the house, really doubling its size in many ways. So we don't see too much of the 1754 house, but it is buried deep within the house as it stands today, and it's one of the most beautiful houses in this area of downtown Plymouth. Here on Coles Hill, we have such a beautiful view of Plymouth Harbor and the portico over Plymouth Rock. This is a spot where so many visitors to Plymouth and residents come and sit and reflect on Plymouth's history. And I think it's important to think about how knowing our history can connect us to our roots, can help us understand how the town of Plymouth grew and changed, help us understand why the town looks the way it does. So even thinking about when houses were built, when streets were laid out. And then it can also sometimes inspire us, where we actually get to hear the stories of people in the past and the choices they made. Some of those stories are inspirational. Some of those stories can be cautionary tales, where we might learn about something that we might choose to do a little bit differently today. History can keep us grounded, help us understand the world around us, and learn how to hopefully communicate better with each other and build the community that we want to have here in Plymouth.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button before you go. We'll see you next time.